is really struggling and has had consistent difficulty in an area. So in kindergarten, your child was really struggling with learning letters, even preschool letters and their sounds, and then they got to kindergarten and they started to blend sounds and to do beginning reading work, and that teacher told you that this was a challenge. And then you get to first grade and your child is still struggling. That would be a time that you may want to seek out assessment. If you as a parent feel like there's something wrong, but you can't put your finger on it, I will tell you over the years I've had a lot of parents come through my office and say, I've worried every year that something is going on with my child. I can't pinpoint it. But what I hope is that you will be able to help me to understand, is there something really going on with my child or not? And if there isn't something that's going on, then that's great. I can sleep well for the next, 15 years. My child will not, call me at 25 and say, I can't believe that you didn't find out I was dyslexic until I was in college, and I can rest better. However, for other parents, most of the time, your gut instinct is right. Very often I have had some parents say, no one thinks that I should do this, but in my heart of hearts, I really feel like there's something going on with my child. And most of the time I will tell you that parents are right about that. So you have to trust your gut as a parent. If your child tells you, I think there's something going on and I really need help. I don't know what's happening with my reading. I don't know why I can't read. I'm so frustrated. Everybody else in my class can do this and I cannot. Listen to your child, because oftentimes children are not seeking answers if they're not in a pretty frustrating place. When you need guidance, so as a parent, if you feel like your child is moving from an elementary school that's lovely and small and supportive to the giant ocean of middle school, and you think that there are some learning challenges that the school has done a really great job of managing and really helping intervening on an individual teacher basis, but yet when your child has 6 teachers, you're very worried that they may fall apart, and so you're needing some additional data. Maybe your child was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 1st or 2nd grade, and you want to try to determine what needs to happen now that you've finished the Neuhaus or Orton-Gillingham-based remediation program for dyslexia. What are your child's skills and what kind of support do they need to move forward? What's the best placement for them from the school, or as you make a transition from middle school to high school, or from elementary to middle school? And then I would never encourage anyone to seek out testing for standardized testing purposes, but I will tell you that a lot of times people will also need documentation as you get into the high school grades for standardized testing. Also, for standardized testing, things like the Stanford test or the ERBs or even the STAR, in order to qualify for any sort of accommodations like extended time, you need to have documented accommodations. And an evaluation is the way that you document that. What I will also tell you is that the College Board and the governance of the ACT do not appreciate when students are evaluated their junior year in high school for the first time, and it is very difficult to garner accommodations the later your children are in high school if you have never had a diagnosis before. And so, again, if you have concerns about your children and you're considering testing, I would encourage you to do that sooner in the high school process than later, especially if you're worried about some sort of standardized testing issue. Even if your child, for example, is really bright and is compensated beautifully, and there truly is a disability, and that doesn't get diagnosed until their junior year, even then, it's very difficult to get those standardized accommodations with the diagnosis. Even though that's a justified diagnosis and the child is compensated, they are looking for a long-term history of accommodations in the school setting, and that's their kind of metric or basis for providing those accommodations for standardized testing. Okay, so again, this is going back to the comment of when children are seeking out an assessment themselves. So you don't want your child to get to this place. The mom says, what did I learn, or the little boy says, what did I learn in school today? In response to, obviously, the mother's question before this slide. I learned I don't like school, okay? We don't want kids to be getting to this place because they're frustrated about the learning experience. Age intervention and testing. For younger students, I will often get calls from parents of children who are in pre-K4, kindergarten especially, and 1st grade. And I always talk to parents about, we have this early window. We know the research suggests that if you intervene between kindergarten and around 2nd grade for dyslexia remediation services, the brain is most fluid and you're most likely to fill in the gaps, like divots in golf, that you would get the piece of grass that you had taken out and you would put it back in the land, and then it would get watered and the sun would shine, and then later on the golf course doesn't look like you had taken a chunk out of it, it's filled in. And so very much like that with dyslexia, for a number of students, we can remediate a lot of those gaps or divots if we get to them when they're young, versus if we wait until they're later in elementary school, the brain is less fluid and easily transformed to fill in some of those gaps. So early intervention is important. What I tell parents though, especially my kindergarten age students or students who are at the very beginning of first grade, we are looking for differences in testing. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, there are standardized measures that we look at for assessing intellectual functioning, for assessing academic areas like reading and writing and math, and those are normed based on other children that are the same age as your child and the same gender, and they're based on population characteristics of the census. So when we're thinking about learning, it's like a staircase. So I'm trying to assess the difference in your child versus other children their age. And if from an educational ladder and development of reading, your child is, 5 and they've gone this far up the ladder, and this is the kind of the basis of the ladder, sometimes some of our instruments are not sensitive enough to pick up on the difference between where your child is and where the peers are. That there's just not enough of a gap, for lack of a better term. So what I will often encourage parents to do is, I will explain this to them on the phone. We can go ahead and move forward with testing. And I'm also looking for the severity of the concern. The more severe the parent describes the concern to me, the more likely I feel like we can go ahead and move forward with the testing process. But for some cases that I feel like are kind of on the border, what I will often encourage parents to do is go ahead and hire a Neuhaus trained therapist. Go ahead and treat your child as though they are dyslexic and start the remediation process. And if in a 6-month period of time the child is not making progress, you're still concerned, then we can look at an assessment process. Or once we get the CALT, the Certified Academic Language Therapist who's providing the remediation for dyslexia involved, and they say, we really need an assessment, then again, they have some data after working with your child for a little bit to help inform the process. But once they get to be really well into the first grade and continue to struggle, then I definitely recommend that you move ahead with an assessment. But in that early window, again, it's not like we're not doing anything. We're providing the kind of remediation that even if I come back with a diagnosis of dyslexia, I would tell you to go and be doing anyway. So we're closing the gaps. Now my caveat to that is, if your child is in the public schools and you're looking to have the district provide those dyslexia intervention services, so a lot of districts have a certified academic language therapist. Most of the time they're not housed on one particular campus. They will visit different campuses during the week and rotate around and visit students. But they can provide those services. And obviously those are not at cost to you, which is a great benefit. And I encourage parents to seek out whatever services they can from their district to help their children. So the problem is that TEA and the Dyslexia Handbook, which is available through the Texas Education Agency website, and it talks about the criteria for dyslexia diagnoses and qualification in the public schools. They have a very specific kind of matrices of ways that children qualify for a dyslexia diagnosis. And so, again, if I think about the staircase and we're looking for a significant difference or weakness for your child compared to where they should be, when you are providing dyslexia-based remediation services at the get-go before you do an assessment, for me, it's probably not going to change my diagnosis out in the private sector, but from a public school standpoint, your child may make just enough progress in that 6-month period that then they don't qualify as their scores being low enough, because you have hopefully filled in some of those gaps and divots as you're moving in that 6-month period. So that would be the only caveat against going ahead and providing those services, is if you were planning on getting the services through the public school, that could close some of the gaps just enough to get you where you didn't qualify for the diagnosis anymore. Okay, all right, so.
Can I go back on that a little bit?
Sure.
So let's say my daughter, she's getting help with the therapist and the dyslexia training. If she improves to a certain point, but she's still not on her grade level, and they can come back and say she's improved, we're no longer gonna provide services?
So as long as she's not reading on grade level, then you should be okay. And what I tell parents is, once you get a diagnosis, sometimes schools will try to get you out of that, but oftentimes getting into the system, the gate into the system is your largest barrier.
Oh, yeah.
So once you've gotten in the system, there's a lot more protection if she makes good progress than if you're not in the system yet. So I think my biggest concern is you're waiting to go in the gate, you don't have any sort of 504 plan, or you haven't been, if your child hasn't been identified as dyslexic based on the district's qualifications. You're going to provide some remediation and then go through the testing process to get into the gate. The problem is that you might not be admitted into the gate anymore because your child could have made just enough progress to put them slightly, like if you move from a score of an 89 to a 90, so it's not considered a deficit anymore by some public
But if
school
she's not on
metrics.
her grade level, it's still
It would, right, so that would still be considered a deficit, provided that all of her scores also line up in the testing process with her not being on grade level. So basically schools are looking for a combination of an educational need, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but educational need would be low testing scores, educational need would be not reading on grade level, educational need would be not passing tests like the STAR test. However, I've even had some districts say, well, most of our students didn't do well on that writing test, and use that as a rationale to even undercut the educational need of a student that's not meeting the benchmarks. But typically you're looking for data that supports that they're not making the progress in the school that they need to be making. The other part that you need is you actually need standardized testing scores that also support their specific deficits in some areas we're going to talk about later, related to, for dyslexia, for example, phonological awareness deficits, rapid naming deficits, deficits in reading made-up words, deficits in reading sight words, deficits in how fast you read. So we're looking for those testing scores to line up to indicate some areas of weakness that are characteristic of dyslexia. And we're looking for an educational need that when your daughter's sitting in her first grade classroom, I don't know what grade she's in, but sitting in her first grade classroom in
She was diagnosed last year.
So she's sitting in her classroom and she's not making progress. Now, sometimes I also feel like report cards and daily work or grades that come home are not the same. So you have all of these grades that are 60s and 70s and maybe some 80s, and then magically on the report card they get a grade of 81. And you're like, I don't understand how this happens. Okay, so the problem is when you're trying as a parent you really have to advocate for your child to, I don't want to say prove educational need, almost like an attorney, but for lack of a better term, you do. If the school district is not wanting to provide services for you, then you're going to have to make your case for your child why they need services in the school. So I encourage parents to keep, all of the 60s and 70s, low 70s, and the work that comes home that doesn't seem to show up in the report card. And you're just going to lay all that on the table and say, I realize they have an 81. I'm not really sure where that came from. Here are the grades that are coming home. How can you not say that this is a need for my child? My child's not passing routine assignments and assessments in her class. And I will say that oftentimes in the public schools, the bulk of dyslexia remediation services are at the elementary school level, so it's even harder by the middle school and high school levels. Typically, those dyslexia therapists that go around to different campuses are assigned to different elementary schools. You're assigned to this elementary school in the morning and this elementary school in the afternoon, and usually they just do a consultant kind of role. At least my experience has been at the middle school and high school that they're very rarely even assigned a day to go and work with students. So I think that just makes it harder. Not that that's any different from a legal perspective of your child having access to the services, but it's just harder to get the district to do that because the resources are not allocated to be there like they are at the elementary school level. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so public versus private testing. So going through testing in your public school versus going through testing in the private sector. Obviously, the largest benefit to testing in your public school is that it's free. So you can refer to the TEA website, the Texas Education Agency website. and the dyslexia handbook to review what your rights are as parents regarding requesting an assessment, regarding how long you have to have an assessment take place after you've signed consent. So nothing in the school district starts in a timeline until you have signed a piece of paper consenting for the assessment. That's the time that the assessment is really beginning. If you have 5 meetings about doing an assessment and you never sign paperwork for consent for an assessment, then nothing is really starting until that time happens. And then the district has a certain number of days to complete the assessment, and usually that process takes several months. A couple of months to have them do the testing, and then another month or so to review the results with you and go over their findings and make a plan about whether your child meets criteria for a diagnosis and accommodations. So the types of assessments. Your child can have a dyslexia screening to determine if they qualify for dyslexia services. So in the public schools, it's kind of like, I think about things like umbrellas with little tentacles, so you can imagine a fun child's umbrella, just like an octopus, but it only has 3 tentacles instead of several, so never mind. Okay, so I don't know that they're actually called tentacles, they're something else, I think, for octopi. But anyway, so it has 3 tentacles coming down, and so you have one is special education. So that's governed by IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was revised in 2004. So that has to do with special education law. So if your child has a significant reading disability or a math learning disability, they're going to need to go to the resource room or to the special education teacher and have remediation. That's one avenue for getting services. Now, if your child is dyslexic, I would not advocate that that's the route that you go, because those special education teachers are lovely, and if any of you are in the room, obviously you guys do a great job of helping kids, but I have found that a lot of the special education teachers do not have specific training in dyslexia remediation. So they have general training in remediating learning disabilities and reading deficits, but they do not have the same training as a certified academic language therapist who only really focuses on dyslexia remediation. And so if your child is dyslexic, you obviously want the most qualified trained person to help with that. So you have special education law, you have 504. So 504 is you're not changing the curriculum. Okay, your child isn't needing to go to the resource room to get intervention because they're not reading on grade level, but you need them to have extra time. You need them to have the test read out loud to them. You need them to go to a quiet room. So you're not changing the curriculum. They're still going to be sitting in their 4th grade science class doing the 4th grade curriculum, but they're going to need some help to take some tests. They're going to need some accommodations, but the curriculum is the same for them. So that's typically a 504 plan. And then you have the Texas dyslexia law. So not all states, actually most states, do not have specific qualifications for dyslexia remediation and identification, but it is a third pathway to acquire services in the schools. And if your child really only has dyslexia and is needing services just for dyslexia or primarily for dyslexia, or needs dyslexia remediation for the public schools, you really want to try to have them qualified under the Texas dyslexia law, because that's where the certified academic language therapists that are paid by the school district are basically, the dollars are tied to going to provide services for your student through the Texas dyslexia law, versus if you put them under the special education umbrella, then they may not have access to those same services. Yes?
I have a question about that, and if you're going to cover it later, then that's okay. But so for our daughter, I knew that there was something, I'm not an educator, I'm a parent, so I knew that there was something not right, so I asked for the dyslexia test. But in that meeting, I also said, should we evaluate for other things? And the question back to me from the school district was, well, what other things do you want to evaluate for? I have no idea, because that's not part of my vernacular. So as parents, I guess, how do we know if there are other things going on? She did the dyslexia test, she tested positive, but I also want to make sure there aren't other things that we're missing at this young age that we should also address.
Sure. So this kind of goes into, and I don't know if I'll just cover it now. So when you think about testing, and this is actually a bullet point later on, so if you skip on down a couple of bullet points, so you can assess in a very different way. Private testing tends to be more thorough, though I have seen some public school evaluators do a phenomenal job and really go in lots of depth. but you don't know who you're going to get. I mean, you sign consent and then the person is assigned to you and you move forward. I have also seen public school testing. I got a call this week or last week from a parent saying, I just got my child's evaluation from the school district and they told me that they do not need to evaluate IQ or intellectual functioning. What do you think about that? And so oftentimes now, again, from a resource perspective and trying to identify children, the public schools are moving towards a model, as we've gone away from an IQ achievement discrepancy to identify a learning disability as the primary basis. A lot of schools have thrown out some intellectual assessment, though typically and you can assess learning disabilities in a variety of different ways now, but typically we're looking for some underlying academic weaknesses and a cognitive or intellectual IQ deficit in certain areas. But what districts are doing now is if you say your child is having problems in math, but reading and writing you're not reporting as being an issue, and their grades are not significantly low in other areas besides math, then the districts will literally only go, not all of them, but some districts now, I'm seeing more and more reports of late, that the districts will go and administer measures, like taking a broad-based measure like the Woodcock-Johnson. So the Woodcock-Johnson, and we'll talk about specific tests later, the Woodcock-Johnson is a very broad-based measure of achievement. They also have a very broad-based measure of cognitive functioning that has many subtests. If you use the standard form, it's 10 or 12, and an extended form is in the 20, like 20 plus subtests. I tend to give almost the whole thing for achievement. There are a couple of subtests I don't give, but I'm giving like 16 of those subtests in a variety of different areas because I want to cover, I guess I don't want to leave stones unturned. If there is something going on, I'm trying to figure out as of a comprehensive picture of your child as I can. The district may literally only take the 4 math subtests from the Woodcock-Johnson, not do anything else, and then do a couple of cognitive tasks that we know are most linked to math disabilities and base their evaluation of your child on that. And they will not look at other academic concerns because those are not expressed. So depending upon the district and the people that are going to be performing the testing, when they're asking you about what you're concerned about, they're trying to determine what are the areas that they really need to assess and what are the areas that they may not. And then you get into the whole issue of if your child has co-occurring ADHD, for example, which is highly co-occurs, happens a lot in kids who have learning challenges. We see a lot of overlap with other psychological concerns either, like anxiety, for example. Some kids, especially if they've been dyslexic and not receiving remediation or identified for a number of years and they're very frustrated, then a lot of times we can see some anxiety and depression in them as well. So that's a different kind of evaluation, even in the school district. So my second bullet point is 504 evaluations, an FIE, which is a full individual evaluation, which is the most comprehensive evaluation that the school district does. But like I said, now I'm seeing FIEs that are really just areas of concern. So an FIE, but it's only for math. And they may have a comment in there. Basically everyone is reporting that the child's reading skills and language skills and writing skills are fine, so we're not going to assess those. And the teacher, and then here's a copy of the report card. And so the only tests that they're administering are ones related to the suspected area of disability. And then you have LSSPs. So LSSPs are licensed specialists in school psychology. In Texas, it's a little different from a licensure perspective. I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm also a licensed specialist in school psychology. In Texas, you have to have dual licenses in order to work in the public and private sector. So I need my license as a psychologist to work in the private sector, but my license as a psychologist doesn't give me any privileges to work in the school district, in the public school district. So I have to have a licensed specialist in school psychology in order to provide any sort of psychological services or evaluation in the public school sector. So if your child is going to be evaluated, let's say you say for ADHD, a diagnostician, which is typically the person who would do an evaluation for a learning disability, or a dyslexia specialist will sometimes do the dyslexia screening. Neither one of those people are qualified to make a diagnosis of ADHD. You have to have a licensed specialist in school psychology who's going to do that. And there are even fewer of those than there are diagnosticians because they require more training. But it's actually very rare for me to see an LSSP do an evaluation for ADHD when there's any sort of reading disability concern. but that's something that you would need to ask for. And then you also have speech and language pathologists who work in the schools, who if your child has any sort of articulation issues or expressive or receptive language, so challenges understanding language, challenges expressing language, and they can provide those services are also available in the public schools, and they do evaluations. But again, that's a separate person doing a separate piece of an evaluation that you would need to be requesting or talking about.
So when they're doing the FIE, and I know you said now there's different standards of that, does ADHD surface at all, even if you're not particularly looking for it? Because, you know, it's hard to determine, like, do we have ADHD or do we have a frustrated child who doesn't want to deal with that anymore?
Right, and everyone is different. When I was in the public schools providing services, I found that a lot of professionals felt like if your child has a learning disability, we would expect them to potentially be frustrated. So let's identify the learning disability first, and then once we provide some services, if they're still struggling, then we might go back and add an ADHD kind of diagnosis. And I can absolutely understand that point if the school setting is the only setting that they're displaying executive functioning deficits. But if they're losing their gym bag and their materials all over the place at home, and you send them upstairs to brush their teeth, and they come downstairs with their Minnie Mouse balloon, and they're like singing, and you're like, did you brush your teeth? And they're like, no. And they're sort of in their own world, and they're displaying a lot of characteristics of ADHD in other settings outside of school that have nothing to do with reading. Then, to me, you would want to go ahead and make a co-occurring diagnosis, because the child could be displaying those symptoms in the school, and in the school setting you may say, well, that's because they don't know what's going on, so of course they're going to be not attending and frustrated. But if you have those same symptoms outside of the context of a learning disability where it's not really as relevant, then assessing for co-occurring ADHD would be important. Sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, oftentimes, some of the scores, for example, on an IQ test, if you've given the whole thing, there's a certain kind of profile that you will see some deficits in a lot of kids who have ADHD. So on that profile, there are a lot of red flags for me that I can tell, like that's a potential concern, or there's certain sub-tests from achievement tests and memory tests that I can give that will be highlights of attention and fluctuations. Oftentimes when I have children, when we're assessing a single area, so if I'm assessing verbal reasoning skills, and there's several sub-tests that go into assessing verbal reasoning skills, I'm expecting those to be fairly consistent. So, a score at the 37th percentile, a score at the 50th percentile, a score at another score at the 50th percentile. So even though you might think, well, 37 to 50 is a pretty big gap, but actually it's a score of a 9 versus a 10. So from a math standpoint, they're pretty similar. Now, if I have a score of at the 37th percentile, and a score at the 63rd percentile, and a score at the 95th percentile, and I'm assessing the same thing, that's a lot of fluctuation. And if I have verbal reasoning is like that, and nonverbal reasoning, like solving picture problems and patterns like that, and memory is like that, I'm seeing a child who is consistently inconsistent. When I'm expecting them to be pretty consistent about answering this task that are supposed to assess a similar kind of construct. So that's also something that I will often see in an ADHD kind of profile. So as an evaluator, there are a lot of things about the way that kids perform that give me indications, is there a co-occurring attention problem that's happening, that I wouldn't really expect to see in just a kid who only is suffering from dyslexia.
Do you mind circling back? You were talking about 504 and special ed, and then the Texas dyslexia law. So I have 4 kids, but one who's been for 4 years we've been in the school dyslexic, and we've always had special ed because he was in speech, but then he graduated out of that, and now he's under 504. But I've not heard about the Texas dyslexia law being something that's ever surfaced in the school chatter.
Under 504 in public schools.
You what?
The Texas dyslexia law is covered under 504.
It's covered under 504. Okay, it's not separate out as a different tentacle like you said. Okay.
So the issue though is about provision of services. So services are not provided, like you can have a 504 plan, but just having a 504 plan does not necessarily mean that your child is going to get dyslexia remediation services.
Okay.
The Texas dyslexia law is basically the law that governs that your child has access to the 504.
I thought it was something separate. Okay. No.
So the services are under the Texas dyslexia law,
Okay.
In terms of provision of the services.
But the concern now is that the federal government is getting on Texas about underqualifying for special education because the Texas dyslexia law exists, and so the public school systems are in between a rock and a hard place to make sure that we're still providing faith. So
We're also underfunded,
right,
so our diagnosticians and whatnot have way too big of a caseload.
Right, which is part of why I think that they've moved towards identifying like the areas of just what suspected disability are, because it's a funding kind of issue.
They can't humanly get through everything they've been asked to do with doing a full evaluation on every single child. It's just, it's not possible.
Is
There's
there
not
anything
enough hours.
is there anything the state is doing to, I guess, or that they can do to prevent that from happening? Because you're saying that it's not, or you recommended that it's not best for students to be eligible under special education, because then they're not working with people specifically trained to do dyslexia service.
I think unless they move into, in special education, having a specific designation for students who are identified as dyslexic, and then they will receive services with a CAL, not just with someone in a special education class. I think that would be the way to go about it, but I'm not.
So it's not the thing that state's going to be able to do, it's going to have to be the school system, the school districts.
I mean, the state could certainly make regulations that for students who are identified as dyslexic through special education, that they receive, services by a trained dyslexia specialist. And then they, earmark funds to do that, but you would have to make it specific. Because that, to me, that's really the breakdown. I mean, I have no problem with kids getting services in special education. I just want kids to get services, but what I found is when I refer my dyslexic kids for special education, they're not getting, or in Gillingham, like dyslexia, certified active language therapists working with them. They're just getting some general reading strategies, and I find that they don't make that kind of progress. I mean, I considered special education for years, and then they get with the dyslexia therapist and they start making the progress, because that's where the evidence-based interventions are. And so it's, I guess, the gap between sometimes evidence-based interventions for dyslexic kids are not being put in place when they're in special education, versus if they're identified under the Texas dyslexia law, that is the intervention. And so there's a closer mirroring of the intervention plus the identification.
So the Texas dyslexia law falls under, it goes under the Title IV. Does it pertain also to special education, or only because it's a state law? It will not go
Can
under?
I interject? I wanted to have a speaker on the handbook a couple of weeks ago, and we will have that video available in our library. The talk today is not on the handbook, the law, it's on understanding the testing. But if you watch for that, we will have that available in our library soon.
Okay. All right, so districts do not have to accept outside testing, they have to consider it, okay? So just because you produce an evaluation that I have done, the district does not have to accept my testing as the be-all, end-all. They have to consider it, they have to look at it, they have to read it, and then they may want to do some of their own testing to support the diagnoses that I have made, or to refute them. The same test cannot be repeated for a year, so I tend to be pretty thorough. A lot of times there's not a lot of tests that are left for the school district to administer when I'm done. But typically, for example, if I gave the Woodcock-Johnson, they could give the Wyatt. So those are two different achievement tests, but you can't give the same test within a year because of practice effects. We want to be sure that we're giving a documented assessment that is valid of your child, not something that they just took the test a month ago and they remember items from it. And then sometimes we differ in diagnostic criteria, we'll talk about later. So public schools are focused on kids meeting a minimum standard, and what's a significant weakness from a statistical standpoint. But I think a lot of people here in this building would tell you that you might have kids and adults who would qualify as being dyslexic, not under federal public school law because their scores are not significantly weak, but let's say that they're a brilliant person, but yet their reading skills are far below that, but maybe they're still in the average range. And so that wouldn't qualify as being a disability under special education or federal law, but that for that individual person, it's still a significant area of weakness, and they may still have features of dyslexia. So we also differ in terms of diagnostic criteria, but I have a lot more flexibility outside of the public sector.
Just before we turn the page, kind of going back, you said there were 3 tentacles. One was the special ed,
One was the Texas dyslexia law. What is the third?
So it's 504.
Oh, that
And
is
she-
the-
Right,
okay.
and so she was talking about that 504 is really part of the Texas dyslexia law, but yeah, the Texas dyslexia law is where the provision of services is actually comes from for dyslexic students versus 504. I mean, you can have an ADHD and have a 504 plan, you can have dyslexia and have a 504 plan, there are a variety of reasons you can have a 504.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Dr. Beard? Yes.
So just as the public school might not accept testing from a licensed psychologist, the private school will not accept testing, some or most will not accept testing from diagnosticians or FSLPs. It has to be a licensed psychologist. And really, I'm just saying it more for information.
Right, so when you get into the private sector for private schools, each school makes their own determination about who they determine to be qualified to assess children within their school. So the school gets to decide, we will accept testing from licensed psychologists, we will accept testing from licensed psychologists and diagnosticians, we'll accept testing from speech and language pathologists and diagnosticians and psychologists. So definitely, before you run out as a parent and get your child evaluated in the private sector, if they go to a private school, I would encourage you to talk to the school's learning specialist or the counselor about people that they routinely work with and they usually have referral lists, so that if you've gone in on the testing, that it's someone that they have a trust or relationship with, or the kind of knowledge and skills base that they feel like is important in terms of determining some sort of learning challenge. So, and again, the private schools as well do not have to, they don't fall under federal law for learning disabilities. There is some, I guess, legal debate about the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, that does govern private schools, but from a legal standpoint, because there's no federal funding that's going there, they don't have to provide the same kinds of services because they're not getting the dollars to do that. A lot of schools do tend to be pretty accommodating, but again, just because I make an accommodation, so let's say, for example, a word bank. If I have some kids who have really significant retrieval problems, they don't recommend this very often, but on occasion I'll have somebody that just really struggles to come up with words, and so a word bank can be a really helpful accommodation for them, instead of having to just fill in the blank with words that they have to pull from their brain. But a school may not be able to provide that, so I can recommend that, but again, the private school does not have to give the student that accommodation if for whatever reason they're not able to do that. But I still encourage them.
Morally and ethically obligated to follow these things? I mean, even if it's not receiving federal funding, I mean, just as a teacher in general, shouldn't they be obligated? You've gone through the testing, and it's been bukus doing that. You come in with this, giant folder, proof that your child has dyslexia. And just because they don't fall under, they have their own guidelines, everything is very different in a private school. But shouldn't they just be morally and ethically obligated to make those accommodations for your child?
So I think that, and I find oftentimes that talking with your individual teachers at the beginning of the year and just telling them about your child and ways that you found can be really helpful. A lot of individual teachers will make accommodations, sometimes above and beyond what documented accommodations are. And so having a rapport with your teacher, I think, is really important. And again, I think it goes back to the resource comment that was made earlier, that whether it be public or private schools, if every child needed a test, let's take the example of my child will do better in a test to take all their tests by themselves. Not even in a small group, but let's say by themselves, in a room by themselves. Well, if you have 60 children that every time they take a test, they need a room by themselves, that just may not be, unless you want to have 60 parent volunteers who are going to sign up and go through training to be test proctors, that just may not be possible for the school to provide, 60 tests a day and where are you going to put them? So I think that's, I totally understand your point of trying to help the students, but then I think there becomes a challenge for some accommodations that are written, like, is that even possible for us? And I think sometimes it's not. You may not have 63 classrooms every day and 60 people to provide that. And then again, that's sort of an extreme example, but oftentimes I find that that's the main reason, though that I think there's also debate. I actually think for math learning disabilities, a formula card is really helpful, and some colleges use that. But, and then I have some learning specialists that are trying to advocate with administrators to say, we really think this is helpful, and here's like documentation. Administrators are like, no, like they need to learn formulas. And so again, I think there's some, I want to say, that people just have some different trains of thought about what's really necessary and how we're helping students versus hindering them. I mean, even a lot of parents say, well, I don't know that I want my child with accommodations because they're going to go in the real world and how are they going to manage? And so I think, again, you also have educators that have different viewpoints of we want to help the child, but we also don't want to enable them, and we want them to be able to do things, and sometimes they don't fully understand maybe the nature of the learning disability, and so I think that's a challenge. Okay, so in terms of terminology, we have index scores and composites, which are kind of overarching summary scores that we'll talk about. We have so an index score, you can have an index score or a composite score for the Wechsler, for example. So the Wechsler, you have a verbal comprehension index or a verbal comprehension composite. And then that's comprised of several scaled scores. So scaled scores, we'll talk more about in a minute, have to do with kind of a base of 10 versus standard scores have to do with a base of 100. And some of them are more sub-test scores, but the Woodcock-Johnson, for example, everything is a standard score, so whether it's a sub-test or a summary or composite score. They still run on that base of 100. And then we have tests versus sub-tests. So the test is usually like for example, the comprehensive test of phonological processing. It's a test. It's commonly used in the identification of some of the underlying deficits related to dyslexia. And it encompasses a variety of different subtests, okay? So the test itself is the larger entity that contains the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. That's a test, and then it has a variety of subtests that are part of that broader test. DSM-5 diagnoses versus special education labels. So in special education, there are a variety of different ways that you qualify for accommodations. You can have an other health impairment or OHI, which is typically where ADHD falls. You can have speech impairment, which is typically where language problems, speech articulation fall for younger children. You can have a specific learning disability, and there are certain areas of learning disability under the law. Special education has to take whatever diagnoses I make and then translate them, if your child were going to qualify for two services under special education, has to take those diagnoses and translate them into what area of disability the students would qualify for special education. And the DSM is what basically psychologists use. It's a book, and it has criteria for various learning and psychological challenges, and then it lists out what the criteria are to meet that diagnosis. And that's what we use in the private sector to make those diagnoses. And then we have IQ, intelligence, or cognitive functioning, so things like working memory, processing speed, verbal reasoning, nonverbal reasoning, and that typically gets broken down into fluid reasoning, which is like picture recognition and problem solving. And then visual spatial reasoning, which is like your ability to put blocks together, to manipulate puzzle pieces and put them together in your mind. And then we have other measures related to cognitive functioning, like long-term storage and retrieval. So once you've learned something, can you pull it back in your mind? Auditory processing, which is that deficit related to phonological awareness that we often see in our dyslexic students. And then we have achievement. And achievement, your reading skills, your reading comprehension abilities, how fast you read, how fast you do math, what your writing skills are like, so written expression. And those are the kinds of things that we see for achievement. Okay, so I have a couple little cartoons. Intelligence test, 2, 4, 6, 8. What comes next? That's almost too easy. Who do we appreciate? Obviously we can all have different interpretations of what's being required, and that doesn't mean that the child doesn't have great knowledge, but they were not necessarily doing the thing that we asked them to do in that moment. And then here, obviously, this is a quote by Albert Einstein. It says, "For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree." It says, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." Okay, so this goes back to my initial cartoon of we want to find areas that kids can thrive. And oftentimes I tell parents, this report about your child is written from a disability standpoint. If I wrote the report talking about how wonderful and great your child is, it wouldn't be documenting the need for them to have support services in the school district. But I do try to talk to parents when we do feedback meetings about the places that the child really does excel. And certainly outside activities, I think it's hard sometimes to balance remediation services for something like dyslexia with soccer or other things, but it's really important for your kid to have some sort of balance in area where they can thrive and have some self-esteem. That's something that's not so hard for them. So IQ tests. In recent years, we've moved away from a reliance upon full-scale IQ scores. I'm going to show you, I hope we have time, some profiles later today. And one of them is actually really similar across the board, and that's more of an anomaly than the norm. Most people, when I look at their verbal reasoning, when I look at their picture problem solving, fluid reasoning, when I look at their working memory and their processing speed, a lot of times I see very varied skills. So they're not like all in the average range. I might have one that's in the average range and one that's above average and one that's below average or low average. So the utility of a full-scale IQ score is only as good, it's an average, is only as good as the numbers that go into it. So if they're all over the place, then that full-scale IQ score doesn't give you a lot of assurance that that's an indicator for the child, versus if all the scores are very close together, then it probably is a good indicator. But because a lot of kids have strengths and weaknesses or peaks and valleys, that full scale IQ score isn't really helpful, which is also part of why we moved away from an IQ achievement discrepancy, because this, the notion that a single IQ score and then subtracting that mathematically just doesn't really hold up well. But again, I think part of it has to do with the flaw of using a full scale IQ score in the first place. So many tests, we now break down intelligence into multiple sections, and we think about those as then being linked to certain areas of learning weakness or disability. All right. So I have two pictures. When I think about, we're going to talk about memory first. It's just one aspect of IQ, memory, and we have actually memory gets broken down into a couple of different areas. So we have both working memory and then long-term storage and retrieval are two areas that are commonly assessed in looking for learning disabilities, or also ADHD. Memory and ADHD are highly linked together. People with ADHD often have memory challenges, especially working memory kinds of challenges. So I want you to think about, we have a table. I have a little table in my office that has a lamp on it between my two chairs, and I say, there's only so much stuff we can put on this table. So when you're reading a paragraph and trying to remember what's in it, there's only so much that your brain can remember on that tabletop. Now the problem is we add an element, we add a conveyor belt to it. So there's also only so much you can remember for so long on the table. And as you're reading the paragraph, if you're not integrating information as you go and making sense of it, it's like the conveyor belt that stuff starts to fall off of it. Okay, so I have a lot of kids that don't consolidate their knowledge while they're reading, for example, or learning a task, listening in a lecture, and so they have these gaps in memory. So you can have short-term memory, which is I'm going to say something right now and you're going to say it right back to me. We have long-term memory, which is I'm going to say something now and I want you to tell it back to me in 30 minutes or tomorrow or next week. And then the working memory has to do with memory that I'm going to say something and then you're going to manipulate it or do something to it and give it back to me. So like a classic example is I'm going to say a set of numbers and you're going to have to say them back to me in the reverse order. Okay? Or you're going to have to give them to me in a numerical sequence. So you're holding something in your mind, you're manipulating, you're doing something with it, and you're giving it back to me. We can do this verbally. So I can say the things, I can give it to you with pictures. So that's more of a visual. And then you have this executive part of memory that we often see related to ADHD. I'm going to tell you to do things, and then you're going to go and have to organize yourself to do a task and come back. And will you remember what you're supposed to be doing? So we assess memory actually in a variety of different ways. We assess memory on the Wechsler or other intelligence scales. Memory is something commonly both long-term storage and retrieval is long-term memory. And then working memory, those are things that we typically see on IQ tests as well as on memory scales. We also look at memory on rating scales. So I often will send out, pretty much always send out rating scales to give rating scales to parents, and then I always ask parents permission to try to send rating scales to teachers, because I feel like if we're going to be working with your child in the school and they spend a lot of their day in school, I want you to partner with the school. And so what their classroom teacher has to say about the child is really important. And then I can make the best recommendations if I have data from the teacher. So one particular measure is the brief. It's now the brief 2, which is the behavior rating inventory of executive function. So that has a scale related to working memory and working memory deficits. So does the child have concentration problems? Do they have a short attention span? Is it hard for them to remain focused on a task, for example? So we can assess working memory or memory in general in a variety of different ways. Okay, so in terms of IQ tests, I would say that the Wechsler scales, and we're going to talk about several of them, and the Woodcock-Johnson test of cognitive abilities are the primary 2 instruments used to assess IQ. Out in the field, though, there are certainly others, so like the Kaufman, the KABC, and the Stanford-Binet are also used. The Stanford-Binet is most documented for kids who have potential intellectual disabilities or who are struggling, or if you've already been administered the Wechsler or the Woodcock-Johnson, it's another measure that you can give to get a gauge of assessment within that year time period if there is an overlap. So the Wechsler is broken down actually into 3 different groups depending on your child's age. So if your child, and they overlap by around a year, so the WIPC is something that's administered to preschool children, and then the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence, so the WIPC is the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, and then we have the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. So the WISC actually begins at age 6, however the WIPC goes, I believe, to 7 years and 4 months, 7 years and some months, but I think it's 4. So there's an overlap. Typically, you would just start administering the WISC when the child turns 6, unless, again, there's a reason that there's some sort of a cognitive delay or impairment that they would need a more simplistic version of the test, which would be the WIPC. But that would really be the only case that I would give the WIPC to a child who was already 6. Typically, I would go ahead and administer the WISC because you're going to have more complicated items to assess more of the strengths as we go on up. And then we have at 16, it moves over to the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So basically they're all sort of synonymous. They don't measure all the same things exactly, and because they're different versions of the test and they come out at different times. For example, the WISC has broken down fluid reasoning and visual spatial processing, which are nonverbal reasoning skills, versus the WACE has all of those subtests, but it doesn't. You have to use another statistical program to calculate some of the indices scores. All right, so the 7 areas that are most commonly associated with ability in terms of documenting different strengths and weaknesses that a child may have. What are their cognitive building blocks for learning related to IQ? So, and these are the things that would commonly be assessed on the Woodcock-Johnson as well as on the Wechsler scales. And then the Wechsler scales, we actually have to do some supplementation, not the WISC-5, but we have some additional measures now to assess all of these. So GC, which is crystallized intelligence or verbal comprehension. So it's your verbal reasoning skills to go about a task. Historically, verbal reasoning was the most linked to school-based performance. So your knowledge of the verbal world. I'd say the caveat to that is math, but that's what we've often thought about intellectual functioning for many years, but it's much more complicated and diverse than that. So auditory processing has to do with the phonological awareness. So that's most linked to dyslexia. We often see kids who are dyslexic have auditory processing deficits. And it's interesting because you are thinking about sounds, they're oral sounds, so I'm asking you to remove sounds from words. I'm asking you to combine sounds to form words. I'm asking you to isolate sounds and words, but if you can't do that on an auditory basis, it's very hard to then apply those skills to reading, so we know that that's very important. Fluid reasoning, which are picture recognition and problem solving skills. So if you have like a pattern and then what comes next in the pattern, not only is that important for things like math problem solving, but that's also really important for reading comprehension, because if you think about what reading comprehension is, it's like a math equation. A plus B plus C happens equals D. Okay, so you're deriving a meaning from these events that are taking place in a story. So fluid reasoning skills are very important in our assessment of reading comprehension as an underlying intellectual skill. Visual spatial skills. So visual spatial skills are your abilities to certainly like geometry and integrate blocks and things in a spatial plane? Can you put puzzles together? But that also includes orthographic processing. So orthographic processing has to do with knowledge of like punctuation and abbreviations and your ability to go back and edit your work. But it also is about homophones. So can you differentiate how to, if there's a cute little whale with a tail, do you know how to spell that? Is that whale like crying or whale like the whale with the tail? And so when you have these words that sound the same but are spelled differently, is your child able to differentiate them? P, Ds, Bs, and Qs, letters of the alphabet in lowercase that look very similar. Is your child able to differentiate those with ease, and especially quickly, or is that something that's challenging for them? Can they unscramble letters to form words? That notion of orthographic processing is very important, again, not only for math and geometry, but also with our reading and understanding the sequence in which letters go. Short-term memory, which we talked about a little earlier, so that also would incorporate working memory, and then we have long-term storage and retrieval as an assessment. So if I can teach you information now, can you remember it later on today or tomorrow? And then processing speed, how fast can you do things? Are you able to take something that's novel, like copy little shapes as fast as you can? How quick are you with that? Common tests of achievement. So these are broad-based measures of achievement. The Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, standard and extended batteries, is probably the most commonly used. The Woodcock-Johnson broke apart the oral language test when they did the 4th revision, and so now you have the oral language test to assess receptive and expressive language or listening comprehension and oral expression separately from the reading and writing and math assessment that's on the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. And then we have the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, the WIAT, which is also used, and it goes through assessing all of the areas of learning disability, the KTEA, the Cochran Test of Educational Achievement. So all of these will mirror the learning disabilities under federal law. So they're basically, if given in their entirety, or at least in the standard form, you're going to get enough of the subtests to look at the child that, you know, there are 8 different areas that we'll talk about later of disability under federal law. So several related to reading, some related to math and written expression. And so they're assessing all of those different areas to see if there are any areas of concern or weakness. And then the process assessment of the learner, which is another measure that looks at some skills that are part of the learning profile and what the child brings to the table. All right, so specialty achievement tests. So sometimes, well, pretty much always, I give the Woodcock-Johnson as a broad-based measure of achievement, and then I follow that up with what I would call a suspected area of disability. So if I have a child who has a math learning disability, sometimes the Woodcock-Johnson gives me all the data that I need. There are 4 math subtests, but other times I just haven't been able to pinpoint what's going on, and so I'll go back and give the key math, which is a measure that's specifically designed for math. Sometimes I will go back at the child, I think he's dyslexic, and I will give the Gray Oral Reading Test to get a specific measure of oral reading accuracy. The Woodcock-Johnson has an oral reading component. It's a subtest, but it's very brief, and I get a lot more data when I go back and I give the Gray Oral Reading Test. The CTOP, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, is something that I give to all my students to assess both the ultra processing part of IQ, but also because it's linked to dyslexia, and so I'm wanting to assess for that. So reading tests. So I have the Gray silent reading test is more of a reading comprehension measure. The Nelson-Denny reading tests are for high school students and college students. It's much more like the SAT. You have to read paragraphs and then do the Scantron based on answering multiple choice comprehension questions. So it's looking at comprehension as well as with speed. The Nelson-Denny also has a vocabulary section that can be administered. In recent years, there's also something called the Pfeiffer assessment of reading. There's also one for math. The test of word reading efficiency. So this is just where kids read words quickly, so it's to do with reading fluency, to give me an extra measure. Other measures that, and again, I never give all of these, but in some of my assessments for a suspected reading concern, I might give 1 or 2 extra tests in addition to the broad-based measure of achievement. Writing.
I just have a question on the reading elements. If you have a child that's tested gifted and they seem to be average or ahead, but they're still showing signs, would those still pick it up if their fluency is average?
Okay, so you're talking, I think about, so let's say that you have a child who's really gifted, and let's say like their math skills are phenomenal, and in terms of written language, There's several different measures that you can give, and I will tell you, quite honestly, as an evaluator, and I've sat in presentations in a room full of, like expert psychologists from around the country, and none of us like the writing measures. There isn't a great measure to really assess writing. I often find that the scores that we get for writing are inflated, for lack of a better term. It's really hard to get a kid to show up as having a significant writing disability. However, I certainly think that it's better to have not only sentence writing, so the Wyatt has tasks of sentence construction, which is the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. The Woodcock-Johnson Test of Achievement not only has individual sentence writing tests, but also has a writing fluency measure. The Wyatt does not have that. I think the writing fluency is an important component because you can write beautiful sentences, but if you take a really long time to write them, then that's important information for me to have, okay? So it's not about your ability to produce content, it's about your ability to produce content in the time period. I also need to know how you do moving from sentences to a paragraph if you're over, in third grade or older. So a lot of times, especially if kids who have ADHD or executive functioning skills or anxiety or other issues, they have trouble with organizing and having their ideas flow. And so it's hard for them to train. They can write a sentence, they can hold it together for that, but if you ask them to put multiple sentences together and keep on a topic and develop their ideas, they get lost in the process sometimes. So having a measure of essay construction is important. So the test of written language has a great creative essay. The Wyatt, I often give the Woodcock-Johnson as my primary measure because I feel like it has a few more indices that are important for me to assess, but I almost always will give the Wyatt as a supplementary measure, just the essay subtest, because I want to see how kids can do in writing paragraphs. The test of orthographic competence, I don't give this to all of my kids, but I started giving it to more of my students over the last few years. And again, it's that notion of orthography that I find is often observed in kids with dyslexia as well as dysgraphia. So that's that knowledge of punctuation, abbreviations, the letter discrimination, the P's, B's, and Q's, the homophones. And so those visual components of language are important in terms of the writing and how you translate that. And then the Beery developmental test of motor integration. So for some of my kids, they have true fine motor deficits. And so that explains part of the writing fluency. Writing is just an arduous, slow task for them. And so I want to assess that. Language, you can assess both expressive and receptive language. So there's the expressive vocabulary test, the EVT, which assesses your ability to say the words based on a picture, versus the PPVT is receptive language. Point to the picture that shows violin, and so they're going to point to that. So I'm trying to assess for language difficulty. So these are things that a lot of speech and language pathologists would give for young children if I suspect that there's a language problem. All right, so then we have the comprehensive assessment of spoken language and the preschool language skills or other measures that speech and language pathologists look at.
Is that like a quick teaching on, I love all the information that you're sharing about these different assessments. It's not written up there. Is there like a one-sentence summary of what this test does? So that when you receive an assessment as a parent, you make sure that they have addressed all of those areas. Or if there's another test available, then you could.
So what I would say is when you're, I'm gonna just scroll back here. Okay. So as a parent, to me, best practice is your assessment has one of these. Has one IQ test, okay? Your assessment has one primary achievement test, okay? So they've given, the person evaluating gave an IQ test from one, preferably from one of these lists. I mean, these are the most documented ones that they've given. Something like, so sometimes they'll give like an abbreviated intelligence score, like the KBIT or like the WASI, or so I don't really like abbreviated intelligence scales, but again, that's my bias. I'm sort of known for giving more tests than fewer tests, but so preferably one of these tests. And as a consumer, you can call and ask, what are the tests that you would give? I try to talk to parents before I do assessments, and I have parents at school ask me this. What kinds of tests would you give? Walk me through that. And then you're going to have one broad-based achievement test. Okay, so usually a Wechsler or a Wyatt, the Wechsler Individual Achievement test or a Woodcock-Johnson, okay? And the Woodcock-Johnson, the test here of oral language is an extra one. People don't have to give that, but to me, again, if I'm trying to assess all of the areas of learning disability under federal law, both receptive, listening, comprehension, and oral expression, the only way to get them is by giving the Woodcock-Johnson test of oral language, okay? So I would need to give that. But some people don't think that they're not concerned about language as an area of disability, so they might not give that. But definitely either the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement or the Wyatt, or the KTEA. Some people really like the KTEA in that, provides all the areas as well. So you'll have one IQ test, one achievement test, and then you have the specialty areas. So again, this is really up to the evaluator. I see a lot of assessments that just have an IQ test and achievement test, broad-based. I tend to dig a little deeper, and so if you were to dig a little deeper, then the evaluator is going to decide which of these would be most appropriate. I mean, you know, obviously the Nelson-Denny, I'm not going to give that unless the child is in high school or college, because that's visual learning. But these are just supplemental tests that I would give to further assess for reading. So this would just mean if you saw one of these with the evaluator, went kind of the extra step to try to uncover things. And the same would be true for the written language and the language skills. I mean, like for example, I very rarely give anything on the language section. I typically will give a couple of things from written language, especially if that's the area of suspected concern. And then math, the key math 3 diagnostic assessment and the Pfeiffer assessment of math. Again, I feel like the Woodcock-Johnson does a pretty good job. It has 4 math subtests versus the Wyatt only has 2. So when I finish the Woodcock-Johnson, most of the time I feel like I have a pretty good gauge of how students do with math, but for a small portion of my students, I feel like I still need more. I need more in order to really help determine interventions for them and to flesh out some of the math difficulties. Like, is it just a reading issue? Is it an attention issue where they get lost in the process and bogged down, or do they truly have a current math disability? Okay, so the importance of multiple points of data. One of the reasons that I like the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement as my standard go-to over the Wyatt is that the Wyatt only has 1 data point. For example, like there's only 1 subtest for math reasoning, and there's only 1 subtest for math calculation. Versus on the Woodcock-Johnson, I'm getting 2 subtests for math calculation, I'm getting 2 subtests for math problem solving, and I would rather base a diagnosis on a child based on a couple of data points, 2 or 3 or 4, rather than just 1. Because again, those can be influenced by factors. The child could have been fatigued, they could have been distracted, something could be going on. I also do feel like we need information from a variety of sources. I think most people in town who know me pretty well would say I err on the side of being more thorough than less, so that's my bias. But I like to have data from IQ testing. I like to have data from achievement. I like to have reading scales and interviews to try to gather as much information as I can about kids to really understand the subtleties of what we've been going on. As we talked about at the very beginning, if your child gets 100 on the is their full scale IQ score on the WISC, the Wexner Intelligence Scale for Children, and you're thinking, hooray, like they got a perfect score. Well, their score actually happens to be right in the middle. So this is the bell-shaped curve, the normal curve, and 100 is right here, the 50th percentile, okay? So some scales, and I have a little handout that was passed out earlier to you guys, which I don't think I actually kept one up, but it has the, yes, this box at the bottom. So it does a really nice job, I'm going to grab one for myself, of talking about scores and different scales. Okay, so we in psychology, unfortunately, like to confuse people, and we can't make up our mind about what is helpful. I don't think that I actually put it on board, so I'm just going to hold it up. But anyway, so if you look down here, I have, it says percent and standard scores, and it has the same bell-shaped curve up at the top. It doesn't look like it's quite as high, but it's still the same issue. And then it goes into percent in the percentage in each category, okay, of the population. The standard score, so the score ranges, and it doesn't have a 0 there, but it just goes 0 to 69, and 70 to 79, and 80 to 89, and 90 to 109. The T-scores, which you guys don't have to worry about too much. Most of the time T-scores are scores that come up on behavioral reading scales. And then you have percentile ranks. And so that's where your child is. So percentile rank is if your child is at the 59th percentile, That means that out of 100 children, they're number 59 in line, okay? So that would be that there are 41 children ahead of them in the line of, if you line of 100 children in terms of that skill, okay? And then 58 children behind them in terms of that skill. And again, most tests are normed based on your child's age in terms of months and years. So then we get to the Wechsler. So the Wechsler scales, we have the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence for my young kids, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, the WISC, and then the WACE, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So those are all the Wechsler scales. Now, the problem is you'll see that I actually handwrote some stuff on here because I'm not very tech savvy, and I got this from another presenter whose name is at the bottom, and I found this on the internet, and I thought this is so great. But since this was since this was written, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC, has come out with a new edition, the 5, and they changed the labels. So now, even though it's all done by the same publisher, a couple of them still use the extremely low, borderline low, average, average, high, average, superior, and very superior ranges. But the WISC uses extremely low, but then for what used to be called the borderline range, 70 to 79, it's the very low range. And then the low, average, average, and high are the same. But then for superior, they no longer call it superior functioning. If your scores are 120 to 129, your score is now very high. And if your score is 130 and above, it's now extremely high instead of very superior. And this is where I say we like to confuse people. And a lot of parents are like, but I don't understand, like my child had superior verbal intelligence before, and now you're telling me they have very high verbal intelligence. Like, what does that mean? Because people have maybe gotten used to one terminology, and then they vary by different scores. So the Woodcock-Johnson also considers average to be slightly different. So all the Wechsler scales and pretty much everything else, average runs 90 to 109, but on the Woodcock-Johnson, average runs 90 to 110. So everything gets thrown off a little bit. So instead of 120 being superior on the Woodcock-Johnson or very high, 120 is actually still in the high average range. So this is kind of like a decoder cheating sheet to help you figure out where things are. The Wyatt is also really weird because the Wyatt has very much like my bell-shaped curve here. So a lot of the scales, the normal curve, even though it runs 80 here, okay, so even though my normal curve runs 85 here to 115, this is where the Wyatt runs, okay, for average. But most scales, average runs 90 to 110, okay, in here. So again, it varies based on what the test is. And so this is kind of a cheat sheet to help a little bit about some of the classifications and just helps you to know how things vary. And if, your child, the good news is if they're average on most of the scales, that's pretty much the same, and low average. So it's low average or below average on some scales, and then high average or above average on some other scales. And then we get into more variability of the scales.
So if your kid tests average, the school will not help you. And if they test below average, the school will help to bring them up to speed? Or how do you, because when you're in the ARD meetings, and they give you numbers and they don't give you the report right away, and you're sitting there and they're telling you all this information, it's overwhelming.
Right.
And they're speaking another language than what you're used to.
Right.
So my question is, they tell me that my kid is average, but when I see the test results, she's below average.
Right, so I think that there are a couple of different things. So one of them, I have some slides later about the issue of having an ARD meeting and asking actually to sit down with the evaluator before you have the formal ARD meeting to review your results. So that you, again, have some knowledge base of what's going on. I also have some slides about how to circle scores that would be considered weak. So by federal standards, pretty much anything below a 90, most people would agree is a weakness, and so we'll get to that a little bit later. And then you also have the issue of, is your child performing average on what? So maybe they're average in lots of areas, but they're weak in certain areas of reading. Are they average in school in terms of grades, or are they weak in terms of certain grades? So you can have a child who has weaknesses on my testing, but is average as a student. So there's no educational need in the school district's perspective because the child is performing up to par in the school setting, and they don't really care what the testing says.
But they're performing average because you have all these accommodations in place. So when you remove those accommodations, then they're not performing up to par with the other students.
Right, so this is the issue that a lot of parents and schools get into debate about because the educational need piece is removed. And this is the part where I tell, that you make that point. And like, for example, I know I sat in meetings with district supervisors and special education coordinators who will tell you, for example, on standard scores, so the standard score that a child receives, so basically, if a child scores 25 out of my 32 items, then I have to make sense of that. How does that 24 raw score, so that's just the number of items they got correct, what does that mean for them compared to other students their age? So basically there's a mathematical conversion to get a number that is on the bell-shaped curve, and that's usually that mean of 100, and at the 50th percentile. So standard scores have a mean of 100. They're typically used for indices or composites, so kind of like the overarching scores, and then Woodpeck Johnson uses them for all of their tests. Scaled scores have a mean of 10. So the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, you have a summary score at the top, the verbal comprehension index, and then I have 3 subtests that go into that. Similarities, vocabulary, and information. And each of those have a score that has a mean of 10. So my verbal comprehension index has a mean of 100, so it's going to be a larger number. And then my subtest scores have a mean of 10. So they're typically like 6s, 7s, 9s, 12s, somewhere like that. All right. So this is where we get into relative strengths and weaknesses versus significant weaknesses or deficits. So the relative weakness, this is the example that we used about the Ferrari versus the Honda Accord, or the electric car that you have to charge repeatedly. Children can have personal weaknesses that would indicate a diagnosis, for example, of dyslexia, but may not qualify them for accommodation in the public schools because the deficits are not considered extreme. That child is still actually functioning at the average level, but for them that's an area of personal or relative weakness or strength. A significant weakness or deficit, like I said before, pretty much everybody in the field agrees that if you have scores in the 80s and below, that's considered a significant deficit or weakness. You don't get a lot of people arguing that that's an area of weak score for people. You're going to think about is this a performance that's below expectations for the child age compared to their peers? Is basically what those numbers tell you when they're in the 80s or 70s, that this is a weakness. And again, if you think, you go back to my chart here, when you get scores in the 80s, percentile ranks the 9th percentile to the 24th percentile, okay? There are a lot of students in your child's age that are performing better than they are on those scores. So it makes sense that you would consider that to be a significant area of deficit for them compared to their peers. And they indicate that your child will likely struggle on tasks related to this area, that it will be a concern for them. All right, so strengths and normal development. So we don't want to just look for all of the things that the child is weak. We want to look for what's intact. Where are they progressing like they're supposed to? Where are the scores in the average range? So in that 90 to 109 or 10 range. And then do they have some areas of strength? Like they're awesome at math problem solving. It's like at the 79th percentile or something. So we want to review that. When you get your testing scores though, you want to look at your profile, your write-up, and circle all the things that are below 90. That's going to be your sort of first place to start when you're triaging. And the lower the scores, the more significant the problem that it is. You can also think about relative strengths and weaknesses. So let's say most of the scores are around 100, but if you have something that's like a 120, so that's more than 15 points, is significantly higher, then you're going to think about, oh, that's really a strength. Like that's something my child does really well. And being sure that you focus on those and developing those talents as much as you can. The same thing would be true if most of your scores are kind of around 100 in the average range, but you have scores of like 85 or 80, something like that, and those are significantly weak for your child. I talked several times earlier today about the areas under federal law for a learning disability, which are oral expression, listening comprehension. So those are the things that are assessed by both the Wyatt and the Woodpeck Johnson tests of oral language. And then we have written expression. Reading is actually broken into several components. You have basic reading skills, which is like decoding, and your sight word reading skills. You have reading fluency, how fast you read. You have reading comprehension, your ability to understand the text. And then you have math calculation. So no word problems here, just straight up 2 plus 2, 27 minus 14, and then your higher level math calculation as well, trigonometry and algebra, and then math problem solving. And math problem solving typically involves word problems. Many measures read those out loud to kids to try to mitigate for reading problems.
Yeah, just a question with regards to the achievement test. Does it matter?
I'm on this.
We'll talk more about all of that
Basically,
stuff.
the list that you have on the next few pages have to do with co-occurring areas of learning disability. So I gave you on the previous page the 8 areas of learning disability under IDEA, which is special education law. And then I basically go in and talk about some of those. So basic reading skills, for example. Before I talked about that we have IQ or cognitive assessment and achievement difficulties. And so one of the models that we're using now, instead of like we're going to subtract your IQ score and your achievement score from your IQ score, and is that significantly different? We don't do that as much anymore, and so we're looking for a weak score, something below 90 typically in one of these areas like basic reading skills. And then do you have a co-occurring cognitive or intellectual deficit in one of these documented areas in the research? So basically what I do is if your child has basic reading skills deficits, then what are the areas cognitively that we would be looking for one or more of to be weak as well that co-occur? That would be one way of determining a learning disability. Another way is to look at a strengths and weaknesses model, but based on a kind of double deficit model, a deficit related to one area of intelligence or processing and a deficit related to the learning disability area, the academic area that's weak. So I can have basic reading skills problems, and then I can have a cognitive area in phonological awareness. That would be very common. You can have some difficulties in crystallized or verbal intelligence, which makes sense because if you're not a reader, then your vocabulary is going to decline. We have lots of research about that, so that may be an area that's weak. We also have rapid automatic naming, which is long-term, short-term retrieval. How fast you recall the names of numbers and letters. You know that automaticity is really important in reading. Working memory and processing speed. Again, it goes back to my tabletop, how much you can remember and how fast you work through and read things is important in your ability to even just hold all of the segments of a word when you're trying to sound it out when you're young on your tabletop and then figure out what that whole word is at the end. And so then it breaks it down into the areas for the other academic learning disability categories: reading comprehension, reading fluency, and then writing achievement and math achievement.
So just to clarify, you have a low area on your achievement test and it correlates with at least one of these areas under that eligibility.
That's one of the ways of determining a learning disability at the present time. So you used to have the discrepancy model where you would just take a full scale IQ score and subtract like a basic reading skills score. And then we'd say, oh, that's more than 15 points, then your child has a learning disability in basic reading skills. And we don't really do that as much anymore. Now school districts can still use that as a kind of backup method, but they've moved away from that. So one of the common processes is looking at a weakness in achievement and a weakness cognitively that ties it together in the research. Another model is just to look at a strengths and weaknesses profile, that this area is significantly weak for this child's profile and it's an area of deficit. But every district is that. So the great thing is we've moved away from an IQ achievement discrepancy that didn't qualify a lot of learners, especially that had lower performing intellectual abilities that really needed help. The problem is that we have a less uniform way of identifying learning disabilities, which leads to more variability kind of in the process.
Do you mind something that, like, can you talk about, like, use other words to say other than he's slow? What does that really mean?
Okay, so processing speed, what I tell parents is it's how fast you take in novel information and process it. So if we're sitting here and I'm talking to you, it's your ability in real time to be taking the words that I'm saying and making sense of them. Okay. Now, the way that we assess that is I'm going to give you novel information. There are tasks that have to do though with fine motor. One of them has fine motor skills and one of them is just a visual scanning. So if you have kids that have visual impairments or that have fine motor difficulties, we would expect their processing speed to be lower. And so the evaluator should be able to talk to you about, again, doing a thorough evaluation, which is part of why I give all of my students a measure of fine motor skills and handwriting, because I need to know that. A lot of people don't, but again, I need to understand why do they have slow processing speed. Now, if they have processing speed on one measure at the 75th percentile, when it's pretty pictures of animals, and on this black and white thing where I look at symbols and match them, their scores at the 16th percentile, that doesn't tell me that they can't process information quickly. It just tells me about how interesting it is for them. And when they have pretty shiny animals that they like, then they rock it. They're awesome. But when it's not very interesting, no thanks. And that's more of an attention piece, So again, as an evaluator, I can look at testing scores, and I joke my computer can't do my job for me, so my job security is pretty safe. Because a computer would just take a summary score and be like, oh, slow processing, and not explain why. So is it a dysgraphia component that's impacting processing speed? Is it an ADHD thing that's impacting processing speed? And a child who has a score of an 81 processing speed index that has a score of 4 on coding, which is fine motor skills, and a score of 14 or 12 on the symbol search, which it's just marking a line, is very different than a child who has scores of 6 or the 9th percentile for both of those. Okay, so that child who scores at the 9th percentile across subtests probably just processes most things at a slow rate. My child who has the 4 for coding, which is fine motor skills, and the 12 for symbol search tells me there's probably a motor problem. And the processing is only when I add a motor component. So I've asked them to write anything, they're going to be really slow. But I've asked them just to look at stuff, or maybe to process auditory information, they're going to be fine.
Interesting.
They're actually above average.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, so it takes you double the amount of time than your peers to take a test, but you can take a test. But verbally, you're good. Okay, interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so what is dyslexia? From the International Dyslexia Association website. So I am not going to take the time to read some of these again. I just want to be sure that I get you out on time, but that I also try to get to the material and answer the questions. All right, so what are some clues? So we're going to talk, is my child dyslexic? We're here at Neuhaus Education Center, so I feel like it's appropriate to spend more time on reading than other learning disabilities. So clues from their history. Children who have early speech and language delays, problems with rhyming. I have a lot of kids who learn letters and sounds all right. That is a trouble for some kids, learning letters and their corresponding sounds, okay? So A makes the A sound, but blending words is also something that really kids struggle. So they do fine. A makes the A sound, B makes the B sound, but if I have to put the B and the L together to make the blah sound, it all falls apart, okay? So that's another potential red flag that I didn't actually list on here, but a family history of dyslexia or reading issues. Again, I think we're much more knowledgeable about testing kids today than we were years ago, but my dad is dyslexic. A lot of times people will just talk about that they struggled to read in some kind of way, that it didn't click, that they were really slow at reading, that they maybe got some extra support for reading when they were younger, or school was just hard for them. And then delayed, slower, or labored reading, and that's from Sally Shavitz. So IDA actually has on their website a great list of what are the areas, if your child is going to have an educational evaluation for dyslexia specifically, what are things that you want to be sure get assessed. And so it gives you a list. Phonological awareness, so that's like the C-top. It's the ability to take away segments of words, the ability to put sounds together. It's those auditory skills that are important in laying the foundations for phonics. Phonological or language-based memory, so your ability to say, interestingly enough, say numbers forwards and backwards. Your ability to, if I give you a made-up word and you can repeat it back to me. So your memory for those sounds and numbers and letters. Rapid automatic naming, so I give you a list of numbers. Can you name them fast? It's automaticity. Can you name the letters that I give you quickly? Receptive vocabulary. Do you have a good foundational basis of language? We actually know that in order to read, it's a hierarchy. You have to have good oral language skills. They're the foundation for reading. And then reading skills build from that, decoding, and then you move on to reading comprehension and fluency, and then you go up the scale as writing, okay? So if you don't have good reading skills, then it's going to be harder for you to write as well. And then phonics skills. So what are the letters and their sounds? Can you decode words? If I give you made up words, can you use your phonics to sound them out, okay? And decode. And then you have real words and nonsense words, okay? So then you have oral reading fluency. You need to have students be able to read words quickly as well as reading sentences and paragraphs quickly. How are the children's spelling skills and how are their writing skills, both at the sentence and the paragraph level? So again, if your district was going to do a shorter assessment, I mean, in a dyslexia screening, they typically don't do all of these kinds of things, especially not writing. But if you were going to recommend certain areas related to dyslexia, this would be a great list to provide the school district to say, these are the things that I want to be assessed if you were concerned about dyslexia and they were trying to do an abridged evaluation.
So, can I just ask real quick, going down that list, when they reassess your child after 3 years, and then ideally, if they've done the appropriate intervention, and wherever there were deficits in these areas, there should be improvement.
Ideally, there should.
Ideally,
Another parent asked me about this earlier. So the research, I think, is around 20% of the population, and I certainly see this in my practice, that I've had parents go through 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, like of the Neuhaus intervention services. And they've gotten it 4 days a week. It's the evidence-based intervention, and there is a section of the population that continues to struggle with phonological awareness despite intervention. But you should see some gains. So some positive improvement, but the child may still struggle. And we also know that reading fluency typically remains weaker over time, that it's just, you become more interested in reading. Reading is less of an arduous task for you. You have the skills to sound out words if you don't know what a word means, that you acquire those kinds of skills, but sometimes reading remains a slower task for you, or the memory is harder. But yes, you definitely should see improvement. And then in terms of, you would actually ask the question over the break of what do you do if you have multiple years of testing? So your child was evaluated in 3rd grade, and they were evaluated in 6th grade, and they were evaluated again in 11th grade, and you have all these numbers, and you're sort of dizzy with thinking about all of them and what do they make sense. So one of the things that I would recommend, and I do this myself for my re-evals, I pull up their old report and then I pull up their new report. And so this actually has some scores on it here. So I pull up the tables in my reports and I compare them before I sit down and go over with parents. What are things that are different? And again, I have the statistical sort of knowledge to figure out if they're significantly different or if it's kind of like just from one day to the next, we don't expect your score to be exactly the same, and that's pretty normal. So where do I see fluctuations from one year to the next? Where do I see improvement cognitively or not? Where do I see improvement academically or not? Are there changes? I have a lot of kids actually who are dyslexic. Their verbal IQ scores will fall over the years because it's the premise that dyslexic children do not have nearly as much exposure to print because they're not readers. And that impacts them, and I actually see declining IQ scores over a period of from elementary to high school because of the vocabulary deficits. The kids just don't have the same exposure to language and words, and it impacts them. And I tell parents, your child is not less intelligent. Okay? Your child did not lose part of their brain between the first time I assessed them and now, but here's where the issue is. And the problem is that this is one of the ways that dyslexia affects your child. And that we, and again, it goes back to I'm a big proponent of using audiobooks and things to try to help build vocabulary and make reading less taxing for them so that they have the same exposure to language as their peers. And it also helps them from a social standpoint, even like elementary and middle school, if everybody's reading, some sort of fun book that your child can read Harry Potter to and have access to that.
With the evaluations, can it improve so much that it doesn't even look like the child has dyslexia anymore?
It can. I would say, so common areas of weakness or deficit on achievement tests. So when a child is dyslexic, typically I'm looking for reading, single word reading deficits or letter word identification, like sight word deficits, okay? So these are the names of some sub-tests. Pseudo word decoding and word attack are basically reading made up or nonsense words. Reading fluency is how fast you read. As children age, obviously if you don't decode words very well, you don't know what a word says, you misread visual as verbal, then that's a problem and your reading comprehension is going to falter. Okay? Spelling is an area that may also be problematic both when kids are young as well as when they get older. And like I said before, it's a staircase that goes up. So we have oral language, reading, writing. We also expect for writing to be impaired as children get older. All right, so common areas of weakness. and deficit on IQ tests, or the CTOP, because the CTOP is a common measure that looks at auditory processing or phonemic awareness. So that's typically something we see. The CTOP also assesses for rapid naming or long-term retrieval. The CTOP can assess for memory as well. It has a memory component for numbers and words. I often pull most of my memory component off of the Wechsler scale, so I do give one subtest from the CTOP that has to do with memory as well. Crystallized or verbal intelligence is something important, and like I said, with the example of that's something I see falling over the years for my kids that are not readers because they don't have that exposure to vocabulary. And then speed, how fast that they read or process information. And again, if you think about reading and sight words isn't just a letter sound process, it's also like reading hieroglyphics, that there really is a visual representation of the word and the sight word memory that goes along with that, and how fast we can sort of recall those letter combinations with a certain word in our mind.
So question with requesting the school to test your child. My daughter, she has ADD, Ph.D, that's already proven. And then I wanted her to test for dyslexia or any other learning disabilities. And like the lady behind us they asked her what other. So in our case, in our letter of requesting testing, we need to say, these are my child's weaknesses, or these are what I want her tested in, and any other possibility of learning deficits as well. So that way, because when they tested my daughter for dyslexia, they basically said she did not have dyslexia. She didn't have reading comprehension. She didn't have trouble with math. And I requested her to be retested. And when she was retested, they said, yes, she does have it. But when I tried to get accommodations for it, the HISD diagnostician still didn't do part of the test. So it was like, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, but I took her to an outside source. And they tested her, but I still think she has other issues. So.
That weren't assessed by the outside provider either.
Right.
Versus dyslexia. So not all, the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that I use, and that psychologists and other professionals use in the private sector to diagnose reading disabilities. It used to be called a reading disorder, and now we call it a specific learning impairment with, a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, and then we can specify comprehension, dyslexia, what that is. So some of my kids have classic dyslexia profiles with deficits in reading fluency, deficits in phonological awareness, deficits in sight word reading and decoding, and deficits sometimes in spelling. But other times, I have kids that have intact skills. They are reading fluency is fine, they have good decoding skills, they have strong phonological awareness. They don't have that classic dyslexia profile, but yet they have reading comprehension deficits, okay? So then that's different. That would still be the same DSM diagnosis for me, a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, but it's not dyslexia, okay? It's a different kind of reading disability that's just comprehension, and they never really had those classic dyslexia characteristics. Sometimes my dyslexic kids have more reading comprehension issues when they're older, but they have historically had those gaps in reading fluency, or especially in phonological awareness and phonics. Now, you can also have broader language-based issues. I mean, I have some kids that started off with not speaking, and they didn't understand language, and they've been going to speech and language therapy for a number of years, and they don't really process sounds very well, but they also have a hard time articulating sounds, they have a hard time hearing the sounds, and so you can still have characteristics of dyslexia, but it can be encompassed in a broader language disorder, that the kid has greater language problems. So it's still dyslexia, but it's kind of housed within something else. So ADHD, I'm not going to talk very long about this, but I do have a number of kids that have dyslexia and ADHD that I have worked with over the years. It's fairly common. So when people talk about ADD versus ADHD, I have a lot of parents who say, but my kid doesn't have ADHD, Dr. Beard, I'm sure they just have ADD. And I'm like, well, the problem is that ADD doesn't really exist. The older version of AD, many years ago, the DSM previous version, before I think I even used it, there was something, it was called attention deficit disorder, which is ADD, and then we moved towards, in the next revision of the DSM, a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and then we would give qualifying subtypes of the predominantly inattentive type of presentation, the hyperactive and impulsive presentation, presentation and the combined presentation if you meet criteria for both. So if your child has ADD, they actually have the predominantly inattentive presentation of ADHD, okay? And again, this is where we have sort of the popular nomenclature and discussions versus what a diagnosis is. About 2/3 of persons with ADHD have another diagnosis in behavioral, psychological, or learning in nature. So again, people with ADHD commonly have other deficits. How is ADHD assessed? Typically through rating scales. This is something in your local school district that your licensed specialist in school psychology would be tasked. The diagnostician is not someone who can diagnose ADHD. You can use computerized tests as supportive measures in addition to rating scales. The bulk of assessment is rating scales, observations, looking at testing data, reviewing report cards and records, and then looking at the deficits, like I said, in the testing data on both achievement and IQ testing. What to do after the assessment? So this is really important. In the public schools, ask to meet with your evaluator privately before your ART or 504 or IAT meeting, so that you have some time as a parent to digest that. If they can give you any, even if it's not the full report, if they can just give you a summary of the scores, just printouts of the scores, so that again you can go and circle the things that are below 90.
And you spoke about the private schools. Does that include charter schools as well?
Charter schools?
Yes.
In terms of what?
Of the testing, because I know you said the private schools have their own way of testing. Does that include, because this is our first year, my daughter's attending a charter school, so I'm concerned with the tests that she has had previously when she was in elementary school. So I haven't got any type of test, so I don't know if they're doing tests in charter school. I haven't even gotten any, I've only gotten her report card, and I wasn't really pleased with it. So from her coming from an elementary school and I'm knowing what her background is, I've only had the ART meeting. I had a request, and I don't want to get off the scale.
You should have a feedback meeting either with an outside professional or with the evaluator who conducted your your evaluation. I would prefer not for that feedback meeting to happen in the middle of an ART or 504 meeting. I would like for you to be able to have some time privately with the evaluator to go over the results. If you don't understand something, please ask in the meeting or afterwards. Review the report when it's given to you. Talk to other parents and professionals. I know that the Houston branch of the International Dyslexia Association does some like parent coffees and other things, which are great ways to network and connect with other parents who have students in similar situations. We've already talked about the educational needs, so you want to bring all those pieces of paperwork that show low scores and how your child is struggling to your meeting, so that if someone says, oh, your child's doing fine, look, they got an 81 on their report card, we think that's appropriate progress, you can say, wait a minute, like, explain this to me, and how can we help my child? If for some reason you don't agree with the plan that's set forth by your school, I encourage you to try to have a working relationship with your school as best as you can, but sometimes you just don't agree on things, and so you can always do something called taping the meeting, which means that you're not going to finish out the meeting, you're basically going to sort of agree to disagree and to go home and to do some research and maybe make some calls to Neuhaus and other places, and then you can reconvene, or you can ask to speak to someone else in the district, so like a 504 coordinator or special education coordinator in the district as well. Okay, so I have my little sinking ship. So as a parent, you're going to think about triage. I mean, the assessment process, coming here and listening to all of these things, there are lots of components. And so when you sit down and have all of these pieces of data about your child, it's a lot to digest and to take in. So you're going to triage. You're going to either think about something that's the most significant weakness that you're going to develop a more longer-term intervention for, or if there are things that are very mild weaknesses that the evaluators talked about, you could do this and it would make a huge difference, and it's pretty small and time limited, and you can feel like you're making progress. But you need to choose ways to focus your efforts, and you're going to choose one or two kind of target areas. So my sinking ship is you don't want mutiny on your ship. If you leave my office and you think, well, Dr. Gray recommended we do 15 things differently, and you come home to your child and you say, guess what? Like, we're going to do all these things differently. There's mutiny on your ship. It's better to take one or two things at a time, gradually implement those, and then once everybody has developed kind of a stability, then you can implement the next thing. You also don't want to send your child to speech therapy and occupational therapy and a dyslexia therapist, all in the same week. It makes them feel like there's something going wrong with them. So it's gradually introducing those services. Be sure that the interventions address the weaknesses on both IQ and achievement if possible. So, for example, if we have weaknesses for IQ related to processing speed and they have motor deficits, well, then we want to be trying to develop a plan for that. With memory, one of my favorite measures to actually give is a neuropsych measure. It's either the Children's Memory Scale for young kids or the Wechsler Memory Scale for adults. And most people do not give that. I trained with a neuropsychologist years ago before I went into private practice, and it's my favorite measure. It actually tells me more about how kids learn than anything else. How do they package information? How do they retrieve it over time? Does it need to be organized? Or do they have the executive functioning skills to process that? And so it helps me to develop some interventions for them to talk about. Are they more auditory or visual learners? Do they need information packaged? Do they need some scaffolding and some help to break things down, in order to boost their memory? And allow your child still to try in the midst of our busy world to have fun and to get to be kids and to build their areas of strength.
What was that test you just mentioned?
The Children's Memory Scale or the Wechsler Memory Scale. And again, I don't think I've ever seen a public school evaluation that has that, and even a lot of psychologists and diagnosticians don't administer that. And it's my own personal bias that I like it the best, but it just tells me a lot about kids. And it doesn't tell me anything about their achievement, other than the fact that it tells me about how they take in information and learn, like sitting in a lecture or with pictures. And if I give them lots of disorganized information, does that overwhelm them? So interestingly enough, a lot of my anxious kids, that's the measure that it most shows up on, about how they break down in class, because they just can't tolerate so much information being presented in a disorganized way.
So is that?
Okay, so it's time to triage. You need to take a deep breath. In the room, it's written here, and we should all take a deep breath. Because the testing is overwhelming. And again, and I have a recommendation, I think on the next page, about knowing people on your team that you don't have to navigate and surrounding yourself with some people who can try to help you and share their wisdom and knowledge with you in a variety of contexts. Look at the numbers and highlight these below 90, and that's going to be the biggest place to start. Look at the recommendations and eligibility and see, is there any sort of plan? And I would often say, the child got the score of 89, and so therefore I'm going to do this. But if you're seeing these reading weaknesses, what are the recommendations that the person is making to address reading concerns in their evaluation? If nothing is recommended for areas of weakness, then you can call the evaluator back, you can ask questions, you can make these as talking points when you go to your meetings at the school. The other thing is you want to evaluate when you're triaging, how much time do you have? How much time does your child have? How many resources do you have? How many resources can you get from the school? So again, the Neuhaus intervention program for dyslexic students, the science behind it, an Orton-Gillingham kind of phonics program is 4 days a week. For about 2 years, and so that's the gold standard of what you're looking for and what you want. And I find a lot of school districts don't provide that much intervention, or even if they say that they do, like somebody's out or sick and it turns out to be like 3 days a week. And I have a lot of parents who do it with 2 days a week, and then they supplement 2 days a week outside if they're able to make up the 4 days a week. But it's trying to advocate for that as best as you can. Explore the options that your child has. School has to do interventions during the school day, whether that's a public school and the dyslexia specialist is coming to the school to work with your child, or it's privately if this private school has some specialists that work there that will allow a specialist to come in and work during the school day. Again, it's freeing your child up to have a childhood after school as best as you can, so that they're not spending all of their time going around to dyslexia therapists and other people after school when they can be playing soccer or doing something fun. We also talked about your team already, so surrounding yourself with people, planning the interventions to address these issues. So again, calling the dyslexia therapist and getting somebody going for that. Going ahead and meeting with the school and figuring out accommodations and putting those in place, and kind of having a checklist that you're going to move down. And again, this is not something that you leave my office or leave the school and you do all in a 48-hour period. It's an ongoing process, and I have parents who will say to me that they go back and reread their children's evaluations every 6 months or every year, and kind of recenter themselves and then kind of make a plan for the year. What have we accomplished? What's maybe changed? What's still the same? And how can we move forward? And then, I don't know, everybody's different. I have some people that, call me 3 years later. I have some people who sail off into the sunset, and then I have some people who call me like every 3 to 6 months and just sort of ask me about different things. And I always tell people that I'm able to brainstorm with them about their kids as best as I can and try to help them if they have something they're navigating through.
I'm just wondering, in terms of...
All right, so level 2, what do you do now? So you're going to look at things that are, if you've accomplished all the things that are at 89 or below, if you have scores at 91 or 92, that's missing a significant area of disability by just a couple of points. Okay, so like on the wrong day, your child could have fallen below. So if you have something that's like 90, 91, 92, 93, somewhere in there, once you've dealt with kind of the larger issues, those are things that you can definitely begin to address and think about, and if you have time and resources to allot to those challenges. If not, you can put them on a list to work on in the summer or breaks, or when there's progress that's made in other areas. Summer, many children regress over the summer, and so it's important to keep up with tutoring or interventions. The Neuhaus and Orton-Gillingham programs were not designed to be 4 days a week, 8 months out of the year, and to take other months off, and we do see regression for lots of kids. This is a historic issue in learning in general, if you have learning challenges, and so continuing to keep up with that as close as you can to the same frequency and duration. And the summer is also a great time to pre-learn for the year as you get older. I have a lot of college students and even high school students. If you can pre-read your books for the year, for English novels, and of course we start to burden students now with so much summer reading. But if your student does not have lots of summer reading, for them to go ahead, and they'll likely need to read books several times. So once is just to get a general framework, and they can do that over the summer. And then when they go back to read it during the school year, they have that scaffolding in the framework, and then they can read it with some depth. And that's what's going to be required of them, especially at the middle and high school level. So I think that that's really helpful. I also have some kids that really are not feeling confident in an area, and I will tell the parents, ask the school what the math textbook is for next year, and see if you can go ahead and get a copy of that. And just go ahead and work through over the summer the first 4 to 6 weeks of math, and then your child starts the year like really excited and feeling like they can do math, and they go in and just have that positive start, as opposed to, oh, we get there and I forgot all this math and I don't remember, and then and I feel overwhelmed, and then we're just trying to dig ourselves out of a hole all of this school year. So sometimes over the summer you can also be strategic about an area where your child lacks confidence, and kind of pre-learning or pre-teaching that information so that they go in feeling more successful as the year starts. So tips and tools for struggling readers. We've already talked about this kind of gold standard for remediation. We've talked about Learning Ally, which is a resource online that you can sign up for with audio versions of textbooks, and the visual is there as well. So you download the book to your iPad, and it highlights the words, and then you hear the text being read to you as well. We do know from the research that foreknowledge, interestingly enough, is the best predictor of reading comprehension. So it's helpful for your child to begin scaffolding before they read something. So if they're going to read a novel, it's helpful to get Cliff Notes or Spark Notes. It's helpful to look up who the characters are. It's helpful to watch the movie. Now, none of those are substitutes for actually reading the book, but it gives them a framework. They go in, if we were going to clean the building, they put scaffolding up. And then it's easier for people to have a place to climb and to hold on to. And our kids need that. And if they're trying to build scaffolding at the same time as they're trying to embed and learn information, it's an overwhelming process for them. So that helps them to have that foundation. Reading the chapter summary before you read the chapter, okay? If you're about to read about the Battle of Gettysburg, just get on Wikipedia and read an article, just summary paragraph about it. So again, you have a little bit of foundational knowledge to then go in and make sense of it when you're reading the passage. We also know, especially for younger kids, like elementary age kids, you're going to kind of break reading into 3 areas. And this is, when I say on level, I mean on their level, not on like grade level. So you're going to give them easy books below their level to build fluency, because we want them to be building their speed with reading. You're going to give them on level books, on their level, not grade level, on their level books to be building their reading skills. And then you're going to read to them or use audiobooks for advanced reading to try to shore up those vocabulary resources, because if they're not reading on grade level, they're missing out on the vocabulary that other kids are exposed to, that's going to be a detriment to them over time in understanding and comprehending. And then also there's the social aspect of reading books like everybody else is reading, and being able to talk about those books and having knowledge about them. Okay, so then I have some resources, but I am actually going to show you guys something else. Okay, so this way that I can not a PowerPoint, I just would represent kind of like a classic dyslexia profile with some intervention, because I'm going to show you sort of the trajectory of what I do expect to change as you've gone through like a Norton Gillingham or Neuhaus-based program. So from an IQ standpoint, here's my summary scores. This child is one, and I talked about earlier, has very similar IQ scores from one scale to the next, which is highly unusual. Because all of her scores are pretty similar. So we're going to call her Jillian, and she's age 9. So basically, I'm not seeing any areas of concern. Typically, working memory and processing speed are places I see lower scores when I'm thinking that a child may have an attention problem. So in this particular case, she has really good, solid intellectual skills to move forward. So this is assessing on the Wechsler, it's 5 of the different G areas. So then, when I look at her, when I look at her, so this is a printout from the Woodcock Johnson. So these are just my printouts, and then I put them in typed form to get to parents. So these are the subtests, all the subtests that I gave to Jillian here. Now, when I start to look, remember my standard scores, things 90 to 109 or 10 are considered average, okay? So when I look at Jillian's letter word identification, which is sight word reading, is an 84 at the 15th percentile. So that's a concern for me. That's an area of weakness. It's below 90. Applied problems with his math problem solving, 98, 45th percentile. Exactly what I would expect. Spelling, 90 at the 25th percentile. Okay, that's, again, I'm missing it being low by a point. So it's just missing the low average range by a single point. So that's weak for me. Passage comprehension, reading comprehension, 85 at the 16th percentile, that's weak. Calculation is fine, 100 at the 49th percentile. Writing samples is fine, 99 at the 47th percentile, so Jillian has pretty good content in her writing. And again, she doesn't lose points for spelling and grammatical kinds of errors on that particular subtest. Sentence reading fluency, 79 at the 8th percentile. Math fluency, 106 at the 65th percentile. So Jillian isn't slow about doing everything, but she's really slow about reading. But math facts are fine for her. Sentence writing fluency. She's also, when I give her the words, and she basically doesn't have to bring words up, and she can just copy them over, she can come up with ideas and put it in a sentence. 96 at the 40th percentile, she can do that quickly. Reading recall. So reading comprehension measure. You read something and give it right back to me. 71 at the 3rd percentile. Word reading fluency, okay? Word reading fluency, 81 at the 11th percentile. Reading vocabulary, 83 at the 13th percentile. So I have deficits with reading comprehension on multiple measures. Passage comprehension is a reading comprehension measure. Reading recall is a reading comprehension measure. And reading vocabulary is a reading comprehension measure. I have deficits in reading fluency. Both of my subtests of reading fluency, sentence reading fluency and word reading fluency, are both significantly low. I have deficits in sight word reading. My spelling is right at the bottom of the average range. Now the one place that's intact is word attack. Okay, so word attack is a 99 at the 47th percentile. This is something that I most commonly see in my kids who have already gotten some intervention for dyslexia. The very basic phonological awareness skills and decoding skills get filled in first because we're trying to teach kids those phonics. They haven't learned to apply them though, or built up their sight word vocabulary. They haven't gotten to the place that their reading is faster. They certainly haven't gotten to the comprehension piece. So this is a kid who looks like they've gotten some intervention for dyslexia that's worked for them already. They're making some progress, but they still have lots of weaknesses, okay? So this is a pretty classic dyslexia profile because I have sight word reading deficits, I have reading fluency and reading comprehension. The only place that's a little bit different, if a child hadn't gotten any remediation, I would expect word attack to also be low. Okay, but that's the first place that usually fills in. So when I look at this profile as an evaluator and I'm going through the numbers, just like I sort of taught you, I'm looking for things that are weak, and I'm looking for clusters of things that all go together that are weak, okay? All right, so now we have someone who is a little different. We have Sally. Sally, we're gonna pretend is a 19-year-old college student. She performs well, but she takes a super long time to study. You know, she's just not very efficient. So we look at Sally. Sally has a verbal comprehension score of 127 at the 96th percentile. Sally has, you know, her nice sports car brain going on. She has visual spatial reasoning skills, her ability to put blocks together to problem solve, 122 at the 93rd percentile. Her fluid reasoning, her abilities to pattern recognition, problem solve, this is also important for reading comprehension. 137th to 99th percentile, okay? So Sally has some incredible strengths. Sally's a really bright young lady. But her memory and processing speed are still, I mean, they're high average, so for most of the population, she's still rocking it. But in this particular instance, they're much weaker than I would expect given her other skills. And Sally actually happens to have ADHD. And that is why there's a big split between her scores in this particular case, both her memory and her processing speed. Though she takes medication, and this is on medication, historically her processing speed and memory were a little bit lower, but with the medication they helped her. Which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. But I always like to see kids on meds one day and off their meds another day for me to try to figure out if I see a difference and if I think everything's going on. And I give the Wechsler intelligence scale on the first day with meds, and I give the children's memory scale without meds on the second day, and so that I can see a little bit of a split. Okay, so when we look at Sally's achievement test, all right, now, if we go up to the top, Sally's, so I'm looking at this kind of paragraph here, Sally's letter word identification, 111. So, you know, we're thinking, well, like nothing's under 90, right? I mean, the lowest score is a 98. But we're going to start to see some gaps. So we have letter word, 111, 76 percentile. We have applied problem solving, 136 to the 99th percentile. So this is kind of commensurate with what we would expect for Sally's intelligence. Spelling, 117, 87th percentile. But Sally also, in general, is pretty bright and probably can remember, just like sight word, like visually remember how to spell a lot of words, and probably that compensates in a lot of ways for her spelling with that. We're going to go down to passage comprehension, 117, 88th percentile. But remember, Sally's best score was fluid reasoning. This is the 99th percentile for reading comprehension, so we have some really good skills to compensate for maybe any gaps in our reading comprehension related to misreading words. Calculation skills, 123, 94th percentile. Writing samples, okay, just content of writing, 132, 98th percentile. Then we go to word attack. Word attack, 107, 67th percentile. We have oral reading accuracy, 98, 45th percentile. Sentence reading fluency, 111, 77th percentile. We have math facts fluency, 110, 76th percentile. So, you know, part of it's the ADHD thing that we're getting with the processing speed. Sentence writing fluency, interestingly enough, there's a huge gap. So I have 132 and 108. Okay, so that's a big difference between timed and untimed measures of writing. And this child also has some dysgraphia features that are going on, which is what's happening there, because there's such a significant gap. And then I have reading recall, 114, and word reading fluency, 102, reading vocabulary, 116. So when you can rely on reasoning and memory, spelling and reading comprehension look much more intact, but their weakest skills are related to decoding, sight word reading, reading accuracy, and some reading fluency, which are clustered dyslexia features. This child also had some phonological awareness and was designated as being at risk for learning disability and reading when they were evaluated at the age of 6. They're really bright and they've been able to compensate for many years. And I had to sit down with these parents. You know, if you look at their profile, look at also listed strengths and weaknesses model. Letter word identification is a significant area of weakness on the Woodcock Johnson for this child. Basic reading skills is a significant area of weakness for this child in their profile. So these are skills that are actually not what we would expect for them to have, just compared to their other achievement, but also compared to their intelligence. Now, if I were to walk into a public school and say that this child was dyslexic and dysgraphic, they would think that I had lost my mind. Not really, but they would just say, that's great, Dr. Beard, but this child really doesn't need any sort of accommodations. But the thing is how incredibly frustrating is it for you in your brain if you're used to functioning, you know, you're driving around in your Ferrari, and then you get into your car that needs to be recharged and it requires a lot of time. And so again, I tried to give you general information for very significant difficulties and services in the schools that require remediation and accommodations for scores less than 90. But sometimes the picture is a little cloudier, and these parents were surprised, but also, I think, validated, because what they've known for a number of years and really seeking out had never really shown up. And actually, previous testing had always shown that some of these scores were weak, but the child's just so likely compensated in a variety of other ways. Yes,
I was just wondering, this particular student obviously had the dyslexic component, which could be remediated with the Neuhaus program or, you know, an Orton-Gilliam type program. What about the dysgraphic component of that? What type of remediation would a child like this need to seek out in order to help that component out?
So dysgraphia, the best intervention we have is really more accommodation. For my younger kids, I will send them to occupational therapy to try to bolster it, especially if it's a fine motor component that I feel like is causing it. You can have some visual dysgraphia, it's pretty rare. I've only had a few cases of that over the tenure of my working, but so you can send them to occupational therapy to try to bolster the motor skills, and sometimes that will really help kids, but then it's really just working on them being the best typist that they can be, having access to a computer, using voice dictation software. A lot of my kids, especially if they have, you know, this kid's verbal intelligence is amazing. So Sally, if I gave her a headset that recognized her words, and she could walk around the room, and I gave her a graphic organizer also, so this like inspiration is one place that you can do like visual organizers online for writing. And so if I help you to get a flow chart of what you want to write, and then I give you a headset and you can walk around your room and get organized with your flow chart, you have the verbal abilities to produce a beautiful text. The problem is translating it to the page is so arduous for you. And so if I can get you to walk around the room, have your flow chart, walk through that and talk out your ideas, and then you sit down and you realize, oh my gosh, I just wrote a page and a half. This is so exciting. And it took me 20 minutes. You know, because I have a lot of kids that just stare at the screen and it's not efficient, or they're sitting at the paper, and the paper is just, it's such a draining task for them versus it. We do know that keyboarding is much better in terms of it's less draining on your motor system. So it's a more efficient way, but I would say voice dictation is even better than that, especially if you can use like a smart program like Dragon Naturally Speaking and teach it kind of how to recognize your speech sounds and your vocabulary. That can be really helpful for the dysgraphic students. Other questions?
The huge gap that you talk about, so